If you've reached this far in the king videos, surely your opponents are castling by now. You don't get to checkmate them right in the middle of the board anymore. But what to do after your opponent castles? Today, we're going to talk about when are the conditions ripe for attacking the castled king. First, let's start off with some tips, as you'll see here on the screen. If you're trying to attack the castled king, I always like to have at least 3 pieces at minimum involved in the attack. Of course, 4 is just gravy, but you need at least 3. Secondly, if the kings are castled on opposite sides, try to create an opened file on the side of the board of the enemy king. We're going to see one example of that later. Next, if your opponent has any defenders, especially minor pieces, try to trade off those defenders to weaken your opponent's king. And lastly, don't trade queens. You'll need her to attack. Let's take a look at examples of all of these ideas. Here is our first position. This is a real chess game that Fun Master Mike played once in the North Carolina State Championship. That's right, the Tar Heel State. I'm white, and if you'll notice here, there's one big defender of the black king, which is the knight. So I started out by playing this maneuver, which looks weird, to go back to h2, but my idea was to trade off those knights, as you'll see here, knight to g4. Now he took and I took, and as you can see, now my queen enters the attack because the black knight is not aiming at g4. My opponent wisely tried to trade queens, but I just told you, you don't want to do that when you're the attacker. So I played queen h5. Here he played queen to d8. Now that looks weird to go back home. His idea is to play bishop g5 and trade off one of my attackers. Now let's take a quick count. Do I have 3 attackers? Well, I would argue that I do. I've got 1, 2, because the bishop is aiming at the king's side, and 3. Now the rook on e1 is going to end up being 4. We're going to see that in a second. First up, a sacrifice in h6. I had this all calculated. He took back, and now before taking the pawn, I played an in-between move. That's right, a Zwischenzug. Queen g6 check because the pawn is pinned. I took, and now it is time for a rook lift. Rook to e3, and the game is basically over if my rook gets to g3. So he played bishop to h4. Now that does 2 things. It stops my rook from going to g3, but it also prepares his queen from coming in. Remember, I don't want to trade queens. So I played the move rook f3, and in this position, black is completely lost. Even though he has a completely free move, I'm going to move up to f5, I'm going to go over to h5, and there's going to be an unstoppable queen and rook battery. One last tactic, chess kids. Do you see what I would have done if he had traded queens by playing queen g5? If you found the move rook g3, well, that's because you're deep into the king levels. You know all about pins, and the bishop is overworked. The bishop's trying to guard g3 and guard the queen. Of course, she can't do both, and when the bishop takes, we're going to lose that queen with check. Everything is going down. Next example. Now, you might be looking at the board saying, wait a minute, Fun Master Mike. The black king's not even castled. Well, this position's all about tricking your opponent into castling when he doesn't want to. Whenever your opponent puts the knight on e7 instead of the happy square on f6, watch out for this trick coming up. We can play the move knight to g5, a double attack on the weak spot f7. There's really only one way to guard the weak spot, and that is to castle. But after castles, because there's no knight on f6, do you see the winning move for white? Queen h5, you got it. We're threatening mate on h7. We now have a triple attack on f7. We do have 3 pieces involved in the attack, and black is going to lose at least a pawn and probably a lot more. On to our next position. This is a famous one that comes from the Sicilian Dragon. Now, black already has an open file. White is about to create one. That's the key thing when kings are castled on opposite sides, making an open file. The first thing that black usually does here is play knight to c4, forking the queen and the dark squared bishop. Now, nobody really expects the knight to be able to win material, but what black has done is he has traded off one of white's king's key defenders, which was that bishop. Now, white is in a race to get his own open file, and he makes a sacrifice. That's right. It's so important to get an open file. Sometimes we even offer material. So black takes, white plays g4, and the knight often goes back. And now we have a very interesting theoretical discussion. Who's better here? Whose open file is going to win the game first? Well, a lot of kids think that white's winning because the queen comes over to h2, makes a battery, and if we just kick that knight out of there, it seems like white's winning. But remember, if the white pawn comes to g5, there actually will be an outpost on h5, and the other method of getting rid of the knight might be knight to d5, but you know what? Black is prompted here to actually make a sacrifice just to open up the white king more. That also, of course, gets rid of the knight's ability to come to the square d5. And now after a move like queen to a5, it almost looks like black is doing the attacking first. I'll make a few more moves. And as you can see in this position, it's actually white that's the one playing defense. So, boys and girls, when the kings are castled on opposite sides, try to be the first person to create an open file and also the first person to attack. Last two examples are Grandmaster chess games. In this position, the famous Paul Morphy was black, the first unofficial world champion of chess. He was from New Orleans, and who doesn't love a good beignet? That's a French donut. In this position, white felt like the black queen was doing awesome, and white was right. So white attempted a trade of queens. But remember, if you're the attacker, you don't want to trade queens. Also remember, I just told you to remove defenders around the enemy king. So black does both things at once. Not only does he avoid the trade of queens, he plays the magnificent, the majestic queen takes bishop. That's right, opening up the king and getting rid of his last defender was that important. It's basically a forced win. Let's watch how the game continues. Takes, rook check, king over. The only piece guarding white's king is this rook, so black goes after it. Bishop to h3. Now you can't offer a trade of rooks. If the rook comes to g1, I'm not even going to make the moves because you can already figure out what's going to happen. Black will trade rooks on g1, and he'll give a back rank mate. You guys already knew that. So instead, the rook went to the square d1, but now we give a check. The king moves. A discovered check. The king moves. And you know what? Black doesn't even want the rook. It's all about mate. We go back to g2, and in this position, we get the bishop in the game. That is the third attacker. In fact, you could almost count this rook up here as the fourth attacker. Okay, there's only one way to stop bishop g2 mate. White had to play the sad but necessary queen to f1, wah, wah, wah. And after takes and takes, black is already up a couple of pawns, and here's the finish of the game. As you might expect, black makes a battery on the second rank, and if you take the bishop, it is the famous corridor mate. Rook takes h2, rook on e to g2, checkmate. A really cool game by Morphy. Our final example is my favorite one of all. In this position, white actually looks pretty safe, and after the no parking sign pawn h3, the grandmaster playing white, I'm sure figured that black knight would go backward, but it was not to be. Watch these next couple of moves. Knight h2, what is that knight doing there? Well, we're about to find out. The rook saves himself, and now comes the amazing knight f3 check. Now, if you don't take the knight, you just lose material. So white accepts it, but of course that creates an opening to his king. Not exactly an open file, but hey, it is a half open file. Queen g5 check. Now if you go to the square f1, it's just mate in 1. Bishop takes h3. So the king instead moves over to the square h1. And if you're counting attackers, well, we do have 3, the queen and 2 bishops. The queen comes into h4, and if we allow that queen to take on h3, it's going to be really, really bad news. I want you to know this checkmate. Let's just give white some sort of random chess move. Here's the mate I want you to know. This is a common checkmating pattern. We actually check with the bishop first to force the king back. Then we discover check the king on g3. Why g3? Well, that's because in this position, the bishop combines with the queen for a queen and helper mate. I wanted to make sure you guys knew that checkmate. So instead, the knight came to f4 to guard the h3 square. Bishop takes h3 anyway. Now, if you take my bishop, I'm going to mate you in the exact same way that I just showed you. So we're not even going to go over it. The knight on c took on d5. Let's add more guys to the attack. Rook to e6. Now, if that rook's allowed to come over, you can see white's not going to survive. So white had to accept the rook, but also that allows the dark squared bishop to have an open line. Bishop to f5 discovered check. King to g1, and because the bishop has opened up the attack on h2, we have queen h2 check. King over. Now it looks like white's escaping. That king, if it gets to the square e2, will have found a little bit of shelter. If you can find this final move, you basically get Fun Master Mike's job. Pause your videos and see if you can figure out the move that caused white to resign. Well, did you get my job? If you played bishop g3, you officially have my job. No, just kidding, I love my job, but maybe when you graduate college, you can have it. We're threatening mate on f2, and there's not a good reply. If you take my bishop, that takes away your king's escape square, and bishop h3 is mate. Amazing. There really isn't any other good chess move. Let's say you try a move like queen to d2 to guard the checkmate. Do you see how the game would finish up here? Well, I can actually distract your queen by playing bishop takes d3 check, and your queen is overworked. If your queen takes, it's checkmate. And if you block with something like the rook, I can mate you on h1, or I can play the even more pretty queen takes f2 checkmate. Well, there you have it, chess kids. Remember my advice. Try to attack with 3 or more pieces. Try to be the first person to make an open line. Try to trade off your opponent's defenders, but keep the ladies on the dance floor.